What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, Robbie, last week, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh published an article providing evidence for the proposition that America was responsible for blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines last September. And the mainstream media has done everything it can to ignore this story even exists. As background, the pipeline connected Russia's natural gas resources to the rest of Europe via Germany, bypassing Ukraine, making it an important resource for the health of Russia's economy. German and Finnish taxpayers spent $11 billion to fund the pipeline, and Europeans stood to benefit from access to Russia's gas reserves. And yet, when the pipeline was destroyed last year, the most prominent mainstream theory was that Russia was responsible. To many, this rationale was confusing. The rationale for why Russia would sabotage its own ability to sell its resources to a lucrative market was never convincingly articulated. In the weeks following the explosion, the New York Times' Melissa Eddy asked, was it the Russians trying to rattle the West, the Americans trying to sever a Russian economic artery, or possibly the Ukrainians trying to take revenge on Russia? But while, per Eddy's op-ed, the motives for America and Ukraine are fairly straightforward, the Russian angle, rattling the West, is plainly lacking by comparison. At the Washington Post, Javier Blas acknowledged suspicions that Joe Biden was responsible, writing that although, quote, on social media, many quickly pointed out that U.S. President Joe Biden had promised to bring an end to the pipeline, conspiracy theorists always see the hand of the CIA in everything. He went on to write that said conspiracy theory was nonsense. Quote, the clear beneficiary of shutting down the Nord Stream pipelines for good is Russian President Vladimir Putin. How's that? Well, Blas's loosely articulated argument was that disconnecting Europe from Russian gas lines would, and in fact did, cause energy prices to soar in Europe. And Russia would happily cut off its nose to apparently spite its face. But Germany stopped final or authorization on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline once Russia invaded Ukraine in February of last year, long before Nord Stream 2 was sabotaged. And when Germany froze construction on Nord Stream 2, the Kremlin responded by saying it hoped that that pause was temporary. Like Germany, it stood to benefit financially from its gas contracts with Europe. And those contracts were arguably more crucial following the economic sanctions the U.S. and Europe imposed on Russia following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Moreover, the Group of Seven Industrialized Nations, or G7, announced a price cap on Russian oil a month before the pipeline sabotage, with the intention of putting a strain on Russia's treasury. If the West understood it could punish Russia by making it more difficult for it to export energy, why would Russia also make it more difficult for itself to export energy? And if the G7 recognized it could place pressure on Russia by dampening its oil exports, doesn't Occam's razor point to a G7 aligned group as responsible for the pipeline explosion? By the end of last year, even mainstream outlets, including the Washington Post, were coming around to the obvious that there was no evidence Russia was behind the attack. But even the Post coverage opines that despite a lack of evidence, Russia could still be responsible, citing, quote, its recent history of bombing civilian infrastructure in Ukraine and propensity for unconventional warfare. It's not such a leap, argued the piece, to think that the Kremlin would attack Nord Stream, perhaps to undermine NATO resolve and peel off allies that depend on Russian energy sources, officials said. But while the journalists at the Post don't see a leap, it's at very least a bit of a stretch, in my view. Let's review what we knew even before Sy Hersh's article. The U.S. Navy had recently been observed doing underwater exercises in the Baltic near the pipeline. Moreover, the U.S.'s interest in fighting the Ukraine proxy war to, quote, weaken Russia is quite obviously different from Germany's interests. As we've covered, Germany relied heavily on Russia for energy, a fact which had caused tension between the U.S. and Germany long before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russian gas contracts had supplied Germany with 60% of its gas, mostly via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was set to double that amount. As Hersh points out, President Biden and his foreign policy team, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, and Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State for Policy, have been vocal and consistent in their hostility to the two pipelines. Now, I know this clip has been played to death, but you know what's coming.
If Russia invades, that means
tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again, then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do that.
Not only did Biden say that, but 20 days prior, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, said the same thing at a State Department briefing, quote, "I want to be very clear to you today, if Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward." Okay, so let's say we have some motive, a tacit admission, and no evidence still that Russia was involved. Now, let's get into what's new from Sy Hersh. Here's a clip of an interview he gave on Democracy Now! Yesterday.
Here's what Biden did, and this is what I think the ultimate point of the story and why so many people, even the intelligence community, are very troubled by it. What he did is he said, I'm in a big war with Ukraine. It's not looking good. I want to be sure I get German and West European support, and I know winter's coming, and if it's going to be bad, I don't want the Germans to say we got to check out because we're getting massacred. We'll be massacred with no cheap fuel, and our economy will go bonkers. We're going to check out and we're going to open up the gas line, which they could do. So he took away that option.
Now, contrast how cogent that narrative is with the Washington Post narrative from before. Okay, about how Russia was responsible for this. Now, based on information from an anonymous source, Hersh reported that last June, quote, Navy divers operating under the cover of a widely publicized midsummer NATO exercise known as Baltic Sea 22 planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines. The source, according to Hersh, has direct knowledge of the operational planning. Hersh explains that the divers involved were trained at a Panama City technical diving facility, an important detail because unlike divers that are members of America's Special Operations Command, operations by these Panama divers didn't need to be reported to Congress or House and Senate leadership. Hersh's report stressed this secrecy. Quote, "This is not kiddie stuff," said a source. "If the attack were to be traced to the U.S., it would be a, quote, act of war." This is why, according to Hersh's source, those involved in planning the attack were dismayed by Biden and Victoria Nuland's statements that all but admitted they had a scheme to stop Nord Stream 2. It was like putting an atomic bomb on the ground in Tokyo and telling the Japanese that we are going to detonate it, said the source. The plan was for the options to be executed post-invasion and not advertised publicly. Biden simply didn't get it or ignored it, according to the source again. But the upside was that Biden's loose lips meant that the CIA could claim the plan was no longer a covert mission. Once it was downgraded to simply highly classified, there was, quote, no longer a legal requirement to report the operation to Congress, according to the source again. Hersh's source went on to detail a plan for the U.S. to approach the target via Norway. He explained that Norway worked well for several reasons. One was a Norwegian antipathy toward Russia. Another was that Norway had a navy full of excellent sailors and divers with deep sea oil and gas exploration experience. Norway also may have been somewhat self-interested. Blowing up Nord Stream meant that its own natural gas became more valuable in the European market. The plan was to place the explosives in June because, for the past 21 years, during that month, the American Sixth Fleet has sponsored a NATO exercise in the Baltic Sea, providing perfect cover. But according to Hersh's source, at the last minute, Biden asked whether the bombs could be activated remotely to create more distance between the NATO exercises and the actual event, presumably to muster up more plausible deniability for U.S. involvement. Now, this was a technically complicated setup, which I encourage you to read about in Hersh's piece. Again, I cannot attest to the veracity of Hersh's reporting or, of course, his source. But to the extent that some people think that detail gives the impression of truthiness, there's a ton there, and you can judge for yourself. Now, at the end of his piece, Hersh points out that the American press treated the Nord Stream sabotage as a mystery and labeled Russia as the only likely culprit without establishing any motive beyond vengeance. And here's an interesting detail. Months after the bombing, Hersh writes that it emerged that Russian authorities had been quietly getting estimates for the cost to repair the pipelines. Not exactly what you would expect from someone who just, blew up the pipelines. But the mainstream U.S. press, on the whole, declined to point fingers at the CIA, even as U.S. officials publicly took a victory lap. Listen to Antony Blinken at a September 30th press conference describing the Nord Stream explosion as a tremendous strategic opportunity.
Ultimately, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy, and thus to take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs. That's very significant, and that offers tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come.
Hersh also includes in his report a quote from Victoria Nuland testifying at a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing in late January. She told Ted Cruz, quote, "Like you, I am, and I think the administration is, very gratified to know that the Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." So, look, there's the evidence, do with it what you like, but let's be clear. There is still, months after the Nord Stream sabotage, no coherent story for why or how Russia carried out this attack. On the other hand, for the U.S., we have motive, albeit anonymous source providing details, and some pretty weird pseudo-admissions from our own political leaders. Now, as some have noted, Hersh does have some history of almost falling for forged documents claiming that JFK bought Marilyn Monroe's silence about their alleged affair. And there have been other moments where dubious information has been leaked to him and perhaps too credulously reported. On the other hand, in lieu of counter-arguments, Hersh has also been openly smeared by establishment journalists, as Aaron Mate points out here in this tweet, and as Glenn Greenwald also points out here. Now, you'll decide on your own what you make of this story, but given the mainstream media's silence on Hersh's report, it's important that you know what's been alleged, what's been buried, and start to ask questions as to why.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of the situation and how people should be thinking about what happened with Nord Stream. As I've said, as we've talked about this, I know that Sy Hersh is a great journalist. He has done tremendous work. And I think that particularly given the comments made by Biden, by Nuland, you're right. The motive element is there. And then Sy Hersh was filling in some of the details for how it would be technically possible. It's plausible, and it is not out of character given what the U.S. has done in the past in terms of covert interventions, assassinations, etc. So you can't say, oh, this is beyond the pale. We would never do this. You're just not paying attention to American history. But all that said, I need more. I need documents, or I need to know who the source is, or I would like to know that other parties vetted the source, etc. So I was just reading a really interesting piece. I'll send it to you after this, from Ian Bremmer, who's a political scientist, who was pushing back on some of what Hersh is saying in his reporting. He says you can publicly track, and he's pointing to people on Twitter who are doing this, and it's a little bit, I think, beyond both our abilities to comprehend. But Hersh claimed that a Norwegian a craft was used to facilitate this, and they're pointing to the tracker saying that all of the crafts we're talking about were not in that area at the time. Now, Bremmer actually thinks it was not. He thinks it was the Ukrainians. He does not find the case against Russia persuasive. And what he's saying, and in this piece, which I think is really interesting for G0, he's saying that he would not have thought the Ukraine's technically capable of this until recently, but they blew up that bridge. They did they assassinated that Russian figure. They've done a couple things that we know are them that are much more technically impressive than you would have thought. And so he thinks that raises the likelihood of it being Ukraine, perhaps with Poland's assistance. So I think that's, I think it's important to keep all that in mind. We really don't know for sure. And anyone making, strong characterizations at this point probably has some agenda too.
Yeah, I think it's not that the evidence of pushback or media blackout is dispositive.
Yeah.
But I do think the fact that there was such a coordinated push among the mainstream kind of corporate outlets that historically are so quick to pick up, State Department lines that are fed to them, and that they were all pointing the finger at Russia, is suspicious in and of itself.
Well, and in the
because
wake
they
of
could-
Russiagate, this is all going
Right.
to be so suspect.
But also, they could have pointed their fingers. If the point was to, defend America or exclude America from consideration, and if the point was actually the truth, then they could have pointed fingers in a lot of other directions that were much more plausible. But it is really remarkable to me that all of these months after the case, no one's really come up with a motive for Russia doing this other than it just wants to throw a monkey wrench in things.
Crazy.
Wild, yeah. So we'll have more Rising for you right after this.